HOA demolished my lake cabin for not paying HOA fees. Too bad my whole family are federal agents. John Harper had always been the type of person who valued peace and quiet. After years of working hard in the bustling cities, climbing the ranks in his career, and dealing with the constant noise and stress, he longed for something simpler. That's when he decided it was time to leave the city behind and move his family to a cabin by the lake. The lake cabin had been in his family for generations. It was a place filled with memories of summer vacations, fishing trips, and warm nights spent around the fire with his siblings and parents. His father had passed it on to him, and now it was his turn to pass it on to his kids. It was the perfect escape from the hectic world, nestled in the woods, surrounded by trees and the calming sounds of nature. John's wife, Karen, was a bit skeptical at first. She loved the idea of a quiet life, but didn't know how well she would adjust to the remote location. Their teenage kids, Amanda and Luke, were also uncertain. They were used to city life, hanging out with friends, and having access to all the conveniences that came with living in a big town. But despite their reservations, they agreed to give it a try. The first few weeks in the cabin were blissful. The family settled in, and John worked on fixing up the place. It needed some repairs, but he didn't mind. The cabin felt like home the moment they stepped inside. The peaceful surroundings made up for the fact that there were no shops or restaurants nearby. It was just them and the serene beauty of nature. However, as with most communities, things weren't always as simple as they seemed. Shortly after moving in, they were introduced to the local homeowners association, or HOA, which governed the area. John had never had much experience with an HOA, but he had heard enough stories to know they could be a bit controlling at times. The HOA in their new neighborhood seemed polite at first, and they welcomed the Harper family to the area. One morning, a letter arrived at the cabin. It was a standard notice from the HOA, informing John that they had noticed the cabin's roof needed some repairs. John wasn't surprised. He had already planned to fix it up soon, but this letter made him realize that the HOA was paying attention to every little detail. The letter politely reminded him of the rules and regulations of the neighborhood, including the upkeep of properties. John wasn't particularly bothered by it. In fact, he was glad that the HOA was looking out for the neighborhood's appearance. After all, it would be a shame for the area to lose its charm because of neglected homes. But as the days passed, more letters came. They were all reminders, some regarding minor things, like trimming the bushes in the yard or repainting the porch. None of it seemed like a big deal, and John took care of everything quickly. Then came the first issue that raised some concern. A letter arrived informing John that he had missed a payment for the HOA fees. The letter was polite but firm, and it stated that the payment was overdue by several months. John was confused. He checked his records and found that he had paid the fees in full when he moved in. He had made sure everything was in order, and there was no way he had missed a payment. He immediately called the HOA office, expecting a simple misunderstanding. But the woman on the other end of the line wasn't very helpful. She insisted that the payment had not been received and the balance was still due. John explained that he had paid, and after some back and forth, the woman promised to look into it and get back to him. Days passed, and John heard nothing. He tried calling again, but this time, no one answered. The situation was starting to frustrate him, but he refused to get worked up over something so small. He figured the issue would resolve itself soon enough. After all, this was a small community, and everyone knew each other. Surely the HOA would sort it out. But the letters kept coming. Now they were not just reminders but warnings. The tone had shifted, becoming more aggressive. The next letter said that if the fees weren't paid immediately, John would be fined. The amount was substantial, and John felt a growing unease in his stomach. This wasn't just about missing a payment anymore. It was about something bigger. John knew there had to be some sort of mistake, but the HOA didn't seem interested in listening to reason. He decided to visit the HOA office in person. It was a small building near the entrance to the neighborhood, and John figured that would be the best way to get answers. When he arrived, he was greeted by a man in his late 40s who looked like he had been working in the same position for years. The man's name was Mr. Parker, and he seemed polite but distant. "I'm here about the fees," John began. "I've been getting these letters, but I've already paid. I need to get this sorted out." Mr. Parker glanced at his computer screen, his fingers clicking away on the keyboard. I'm sorry, Mr. Harper, but we don't show any payments from your account. You're still listed as overdue? John was taken aback. That's impossible. I have the receipts right here, he said, pulling out the documents from his folder. He had kept everything organized just in case. Mr. Parker glanced at the papers and then back at his screen. He didn't look convinced. I'm afraid we have no record of it. You'll need to pay the balance immediately to avoid further penalties. John's frustration grew. You don't understand, he said, trying to stay calm. I paid the fees when I moved in. There must be an error in your system. Mr. Parker shook his head. I'm afraid there's nothing I can do. The system shows that you owe, and we're not in the habit of making exceptions. John left the office feeling more confused than ever. He knew something wasn't right, but he couldn't figure out what was going on. It was as if the HOA wasn't even interested in hearing his side of the story. He decided to send a final letter to the HOA, requesting that they review their records and resolve the issue before it got any worse. But he had a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. John Harper's frustration grew each day as the situation with the HOA seemed to worsen. He had sent several polite letters, trying to get the matter resolved, but all he received in return were more aggressive notices demanding payment. Each letter came with a more stern tone, and the fines for not paying continued to increase. The HOA wasn't showing any signs of backing down, and John was beginning to feel like he was fighting a losing battle. The last letter he received was the final straw. It stated that if the fees weren't paid within the next 5 days, the HOA would begin legal action to seize the property. John felt a pit in his stomach. His cabin, the one that had been passed down for generations, was now under threat. The thought that someone, especially an organization like the HOA, could take away something so important to his family was unimaginable. John immediately called Karen, his wife, to tell her about the latest letter. They had already discussed the situation several times, but this was different. It wasn't just about some small disagreement. It was about the ownership of their home. Karen, we need to do something. They're threatening to take the cabin, John said, his voice tense. Karen, ever the voice of reason, stayed calm. I'll handle it, John. We can't let them take it from us. We'll get a lawyer and we'll sort this out. But John could tell by the sound of her voice that she was just as worried as he was. Karen had always been the steady one in the family, and John knew that if anyone could handle a situation like this, it was her. She had worked for the FBI for years and had seen her fair share of complicated cases. She was used to dealing with powerful organizations and navigating the complexities of the law. But this situation was different. It wasn't a criminal case or something that could be solved with the usual tactics. This was personal. The next day, Karen called a lawyer who specialized in property law. He was an old friend of hers from her early days in the FBI, and she knew he would give them the best advice. The lawyer's name was Robert, and he had a reputation for being tough on anyone who tried to take advantage of people. After listening to Karen explain the situation, Robert's first response was clear. This isn't right, Robert said. The HOA doesn't have the power to do what they're threatening. They can't just take your property like that, not without going through the proper legal channels. They've likely overstepped their bounds, and I think it's time to take action. John felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. So what do we do now? He asked. I'll start by reviewing the HOA's records, Robert said. I'll also make sure they've been following the law when it comes to fees and the proper procedures for foreclosure. If they haven't, we'll take them to court. It was the first positive step they had taken in what felt like an endless battle, but Karen knew it wouldn't be easy. The HOA had a lot of power, and they were well connected within the community. The fact that the HOA had already sent multiple letters and threatened legal action meant they had probably been preparing for this fight long before John and Karen had even realized it was coming. Over the next few days, Karen kept in close contact with Robert. He worked quickly, digging into the HOA's records and finding out what he could. The more he investigated, the clearer it became that the HOA had been operating in a way that was less than transparent. The fees they were charging weren't as straightforward as they seemed, and there was no clear evidence that John had ever missed a payment. In fact, Robert discovered that there were discrepancies in the HOA's financial records, suggesting that they may have been mismanaging funds and charging residents for things that didn't exist. As Karen learned more about the situation, her anger grew. She had always believed in justice, and this wasn't just a case of bad business practices. This was an attempt to bully a hardworking family out of their home. The more she thought about it, the more she realized just how many people in the neighborhood might be in the same position as John. They were all at the mercy of an organization that was more interested in collecting money than in keeping the community running smoothly. One evening, Karen sat down with John to go over everything Robert had uncovered. They sat at the kitchen table, the soft light of the lamp above them casting shadows on the papers in front of them. "We've got them, John," Karen said, her voice full of determination. "The HOA doesn't have the authority to do this. They've been running their operation without proper checks and balances, and they've been taking money from people without following the law. They've been violating their own bylaws." John leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "So what do we do now?" "We fight back," Karen replied. "We're going to take this to court and we're going to make sure everyone knows what they've been doing. This isn't just about us anymore. This is about standing up for what's right." John nodded, his heart swelling with pride for his wife. He had always known she was strong, but this was something else entirely. She wasn't just protecting their family, she was fighting for everyone who had been wronged by the HOA. The next morning, Karen made the call to Robert, and they agreed to move forward with the legal action. Robert would file a lawsuit against the HOA, demanding they cease their attempts to seize the property and that they reimburse John for any damages caused by their actions. But Karen knew that even with Robert's expertise, this wouldn't be easy. The HOA had the money, the resources, and the connections to make things difficult. At the same time, John knew they had something the HOA didn't, the truth on their side. And they had the support of Karen's federal connections, which could prove invaluable. If they had to, they would expose everything the HOA had been hiding. While Karen was focused on the legal side of things, John took matters into his own hands. He began to talk to neighbors, asking if they had experienced similar issues with the HOA. He quickly learned that he wasn't the only one. Many residents had received strange fees or threats over the years, but most had quietly paid to avoid further hassle. John realized that the HOA's tactics weren't new. They had been bullying people into submission for years, but now that the truth was out, it was time to fight back. Soon, word began to spread, and other residents came forward to share their stories. The more people who spoke out, the stronger their case became. The HOA's hold over the neighborhood was starting to crack, but the battle was far from over. As Karen and John prepared for the court case, they knew they were facing a long and difficult road ahead. They couldn't afford to back down. This was about more than just their cabin. It was about protecting their home, their family, and their rights. The fight against the HOA was about to become more intense. John and Karen had made the decision to take legal action, and they were fully prepared to do whatever it took to keep their cabin. It wasn't just about a piece of property anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, and about showing that no one could push them around just because they were a family of ordinary people. As Karen worked with Robert, their lawyer, John focused on gathering more evidence. He started by reaching out to other residents in the neighborhood who had been impacted by the HOA's aggressive tactics. It wasn't long before he found that he wasn't the only one who had received strange letters, unnecessary fines, or unjustified fees. Many of his neighbors had suffered in silence, too afraid to speak out against the powerful HOA. The more John heard, the more he realized how deep the corruption ran. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Landers, invited John over to her house to talk. She had lived in the neighborhood for decades and had always paid her fees on time. But recently, she had been hit with what she called mysterious fines. At first, the fees seemed harmless, just small charges for things like yard maintenance and property inspections. But the amounts added up quickly, and when she questioned the HOA about the charges, they became hostile. "They told me I owed more money, and when I asked for proof, they just sent me another letter saying it was all legally binding," Mrs. Landers explained, her hands trembling as she spoke. "I paid because I didn't know what else to do, but now I regret it." John listened carefully. Mrs. Landers was clearly not the only one. He had heard similar stories from other neighbors, some of whom were too afraid to come forward. It was clear that the HOA had been taking advantage of people's fear and ignorance, especially those who didn't have the means to fight back. The more John gathered, the stronger his resolve became. He couldn't let this go on any longer. Karen, meanwhile, was working tirelessly with Robert. They were digging deeper into the HOA's financial records, looking for any signs of misconduct. The lawyer had already discovered that the HOA had been operating without proper accounting practices. They had been collecting fees from residents without proper documentation or receipts. In fact, some of the funds were being funneled into private accounts, which was illegal. Robert was confident that they had enough evidence to bring the case to court, but Karen knew they needed to act fast. The longer they waited, the more time the HOA had to cover their tracks. "We've got them," Karen told John one evening, her voice full of determination. "The HOA's books are a mess, and we've already found multiple instances of fraud. If they go to court, they won't stand a chance." John felt a sense of relief wash over him, but he knew the fight wasn't over yet. The HOA was a powerful organization, and they wouldn't go down easily. They had deep pockets, and they were willing to do whatever it took to keep their control over the neighborhood. But John wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. As Karen and Robert prepared their case, John continued to talk to more neighbors, rallying them together. He had come to realize that this wasn't just a battle for his family's cabin. It was a fight for everyone who had been wronged by the HOA. He began to organize meetings, telling his neighbors about the fraud and encouraging them to come forward and testify. Slowly but surely, more people joined the cause. One of the most surprising moments came when the local town council member, a man named Derek Harper, no relation to John, reached out to offer his support. Derek had been suspicious of the HOA for years, but as a public official, he had been hesitant to take a stand. After hearing what John had uncovered, however, he decided it was time to speak out. "I've been waiting for someone to take them on," Derek said. "The HOA has been getting away with this for too long, and it's time for someone to hold them accountable. I'll support you in any way I can." John couldn't believe it. He had assumed that someone in a position of power would be too afraid to get involved, but Derek was different. He had seen enough to know that the HOA was corrupt, and he was ready to take a stand. With Derek's support, the movement to expose the HOA grew stronger. As more and more neighbors came forward, the pressure on the HOA began to build. The organization, which had once seemed untouchable, was now under threat. But John and Karen knew they couldn't stop now. They had to keep pushing, no matter how difficult it became. The turning point came when Karen received a phone call from Robert. He had some news that would change everything. "They're scared," Robert said, his voice filled with excitement. "The HOA is starting to panic. They know we're serious now, and they're trying to make a deal." John's heart raced. "What kind of deal?" "They're offering a settlement," Robert explained. "They want to avoid going to court, and they're willing to pay you a substantial amount of money in exchange for dropping the case." John wasn't sure how to react. On the one hand, the money could help them rebuild the cabin and cover the damages caused by the demolition. But on the other hand, a settlement would mean letting the HOA off the hook for everything they had done. John wasn't sure he could accept that. Karen, however, was more pragmatic. "We need to think about this carefully," she said. "A settlement might be the quickest way to get the compensation we deserve, but we can't let them off the hook. We need to make sure they're held accountable for their actions." After much discussion, John and Karen decided they would not settle for anything less than a full admission of guilt from the HOA and a commitment to stop their fraudulent practices. They would only accept a settlement if the HOA publicly apologized and agreed to compensate all the residents who had been wronged. If the HOA refused, they would continue their legal battle in court. Karen sent a letter to the HOA outlining their terms. It was clear and firm. They would accept a settlement, but only on their terms. They demanded an apology, full reimbursement, and a promise that the HOA would cease its illegal activities. John and Karen knew the HOA would likely push back. They weren't going to give in easily, especially after years of controlling the neighborhood. But John wasn't afraid anymore. They had the truth on their side, and they weren't going to let anyone take their home or their future away from them. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty, but John and Karen remained determined. They had made their stance clear to the HOA. They weren't just going to accept a quick settlement without accountability. They wanted justice. The tension was palpable, especially as they awaited a response from the HOA to the letter Karen had sent outlining their terms. In the meantime, Karen continued to work closely with Robert, their lawyer, preparing for the possibility that the HOA might refuse to meet their demands. Karen wasn't one to back down, and neither was John. They both knew that the fight ahead wasn't just about money or property. It was about standing up for what was right. It was about protecting their home and ensuring that no one, not even an organization like the HOA, could abuse their power to take advantage of others. One afternoon, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, Karen received a phone call from Robert. He had news. "I've heard back from the HOA," Robert said, his voice measured but with a hint of excitement. "They've agreed to your terms." John felt a rush of relief wash over him, but he remained cautious. "What exactly do they want in return?" he asked. "They're willing to publicly apologize, reimburse all the residents who have been affected, and ensure that all their future actions follow the law," Robert explained. "They're also agreeing to have their financial records audited by an independent third party." John's mind raced. It sounded like a victory, but was it enough? They had asked for a full admission of guilt, but would this really bring about the kind of change they needed? Karen, who had been listening on the other end, chimed in. "This is a huge step forward," she said. "We have the public apology and the commitment to stop their illegal activities. This could set a precedent for everyone who's been wronged by them." John paused, weighing the situation carefully. He knew that agreeing to this settlement would allow them to move forward, to finally put the nightmare behind them and rebuild their cabin. It would also allow the other residents who had been exploited by the HOA to get the compensation they deserved. But there was still one thing that bothered him. The HOA had caused so much harm over the years, and simply agreeing to a settlement felt like it might not be enough to stop them from doing the same thing again in the future. "I think we should take it," John finally said. "But only if we ensure this never happens again. We can't let them get away with just paying us off. This has to be about protecting everyone in the neighborhood." Karen agreed, and they both decided to move forward with the settlement. But they would keep pushing for safeguards to ensure the HOA couldn't continue their fraudulent practices in the future. They also made sure that the compensation would cover not just the damages to their cabin, but also the emotional distress and the trouble the HOA's actions had caused their family. The HOA, on the other hand, seemed eager to put the situation behind them. Their lawyer contacted Robert, and after a few rounds of negotiation, the settlement was officially signed. The HOA issued a public apology, acknowledging their wrongdoing and committing to change. The residents who had been affected by their illegal fees were reimbursed, and the HOA's financial records were placed under scrutiny by an independent auditor. It wasn't the full victory they had hoped for, but it was a significant step in the right direction. For the next few weeks, John and Karen focused on rebuilding their cabin. The process was slow, but with the settlement funds, they were able to repair the damage caused by the demolition crew. It wasn't just about fixing the cabin, it was about restoring their peace of mind. The cabin, which had been a symbol of their family's history and memories, now felt like a symbol of their resilience. The work was hard, but John found satisfaction in it. He spent long hours rebuilding the roof, fixing the walls, and making sure everything was as it should be. Karen, too, helped when she could, but her focus was on managing the legal aftermath and ensuring that the HOA followed through on their promises. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but every nail hammered into the wood, every layer of paint applied, brought them closer to making their home whole again. Meanwhile, the news of the settlement spread throughout the neighborhood. Many residents who had been too afraid to speak out came forward to express their relief and gratitude. Some of them had been dealing with the HOA's bullying tactics for years, and seeing the organization held accountable gave them hope. John and Karen became local heroes, not just for their courage in standing up to the HOA, but for inspiring others to do the same. One evening, as John sat on the porch of the newly repaired cabin, he looked out over the lake, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. The sound of the water lapping gently against the shore was calming, and the air smelled fresh and crisp. He could hear the distant chirping of birds, the rustling of the leaves in the trees. It was everything he had wanted when he first decided to move his family here. Karen joined him on the porch, sitting down beside him with a smile. "We did it, didn't we?" she said softly, looking out over the water. John nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "We did," he said. "It wasn't easy, but we stood our ground. We protected our home, and we helped others do the same." Karen leaned her head on his shoulder, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "I'm proud of us. You were right when you said we couldn't let them get away with it. We had to do something." John smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the family he had and for the life they had built together. "It was a team effort," he said, his arm around her. "We wouldn't have made it through without each other." As they sat together, the weight of the past few months slowly lifted from their shoulders. The cabin was whole again, and with it, their lives were starting to feel normal once more. They had fought for what was right, and while the road had been long and hard, it had been worth it. The HOA's power had been broken, and the residents of the neighborhood had learned a valuable lesson. That standing up for what was right, no matter how intimidating the opposition, was always worth it. John and Karen's victory wasn't just about restoring their cabin. It was about restoring the integrity of the community and showing everyone that change was possible, no matter how powerful the forces working against you might seem. As the sun set over the lake, casting a golden glow across the water, John and Karen sat in silence, grateful for the peace that had finally returned to their lives. The future, once uncertain, now seemed full of promise. The battle had been won, and their home, their family, and their neighborhood had been restored. As the weeks passed, life in the lake cabin began to settle into a peaceful routine once again. The repairs were almost complete, and while there were still some finishing touches to be made, John and Karen were finally able to enjoy the space they had worked so hard to reclaim. The neighborhood, too, had started to feel different. The once overbearing presence of the HOA had faded, replaced by a sense of freedom and community that hadn't been there before. People were starting to speak up, sharing stories of their own struggles with the HOA and coming together in a way they hadn't in years. Despite the outward calm, the consequences of their fight were far from over. John knew that the HOA's defeat had caused ripples far beyond their immediate neighborhood. The HOA, now facing legal scrutiny and public backlash, was no longer the untouchable entity it once was. The settlement, which had seemed like the end of the matter, had only marked the beginning of something much bigger. One afternoon, Karen received a call from Robert, their lawyer. This time, the news was unexpected. "Karen, I need to talk to you about something important," Robert began. His voice, usually calm and confident, carried a sense of urgency. "The HOA is fighting back." Karen sat up straight, her heart racing. "What do you mean, fighting back?" "They filed a motion to appeal the settlement," Robert explained. "They're not happy with the terms, especially the public apology and the audit of their financial records. They're trying to get the settlement overturned, claiming that it wasn't fair." Karen was stunned. "But we agreed to the terms. We didn't make any unreasonable demands. This was about holding them accountable." "I know," Robert replied. "But the HOA is trying to argue that the settlement is too harsh and that it's causing them harm. They want to take this to court and have the terms revised. It's a long shot, but they think they might be able to turn this around." Karen felt a surge of frustration. They had already won, hadn't they? The public apology, the reimbursement to the residents, the audit, those were things that would ensure the HOA couldn't continue their fraudulent practices. What more did the HOA want? She hung up the phone, feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on her once again. John, who had been working on the repairs outside, came into the house just as Karen set the phone down. She could see the concern on his face before he even spoke. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting down beside her. "Robert just called," Karen said, her voice heavy. "The HOA is appealing the settlement. They want to change the terms and get the settlement overturned." John clenched his fists, his frustration mirroring Karen's. "What? They've already lost. They agreed to the terms. They can't just back out now." "I know," Karen said, rubbing her temples, "but they're trying to argue that the settlement is unfair. They're using legal loopholes, and they think they can get a judge to side with them." John leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. He knew this was far from over. The HOA wasn't going to give up easily, and if they were willing to go to court again, it meant they still had a lot of power. But John wasn't about to let them have the last word, not after everything they had been through. "We can't let them win, Karen," John said firmly. We've come this far and we've already made a difference. We can't let them take that away. I agree, Karen said, but we need to be strategic. The last thing we want is to end up in another long, drawn-out court battle. We need to make sure we have everything in place before we move forward, John nodded. What's the next step? We'll need to prepare for the appeal, Karen said. Robert will help us with that. We can't let the HOA get away with trying to rewrite the terms. They've already agreed to everything. If we fight back now, we have a good chance of keeping the settlement intact. As the days passed, John and Karen worked with Robert to prepare for the appeal. They knew the HOA would do everything in their power to reverse the settlement, and they couldn't afford to underestimate their opponents. But with each passing day, John grew more confident. The HOA might have money and resources, but they didn't have the truth on their side. The court date was set, and as they entered the courtroom, John and Karen felt a sense of determination. They weren't going to let the HOA take away their hard-earned victory. This time, they would fight with everything they had. The courtroom was packed with people, many of them former residents of the neighborhood who had been affected by the HOA's actions. They had come to show their support, to stand with John and Karen. There were also several reporters, eager to cover the ongoing legal battle between the HOA and the residents. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited for the judge to enter. When the judge finally took his seat, the proceedings began. The HOA's lawyer stood up first, arguing that the settlement was too harsh and that the HOA had been unfairly treated. They claimed that the public apology was unnecessary and that the financial audit would damage the organization's reputation. Karen's heart raced as she listened to the arguments. The HOA was trying to paint themselves as the victim, twisting the facts to suit their narrative. But Karen knew better. They weren't the victims. They had been the ones doing the bullying, the intimidation, the fraud. They were the ones who had taken advantage of good people, and now they were trying to weasel their way out of it. When it was their turn, Karen and Robert made their case. They presented evidence of the HOA's wrongdoing, including financial records, testimonies from residents, and documentation of the settlement agreement. They argued that the settlement had been fair and that the HOA had agreed to it voluntarily. The public apology and the audit were necessary to ensure that the HOA could no longer engage in illegal activities. The judge listened carefully to both sides, taking notes and asking questions. After what felt like an eternity, he called for a short recess. When the court reconvened, the judge delivered his decision. "The settlement will stand," he said, his voice firm. "The HOA must comply with the terms of the agreement, including the public apology, the reimbursement to residents, and the independent audit of their financial records. Any further attempts to change these terms will be denied." John and Karen exchanged a look of relief. It was over. The judge had sided with them. The HOA had lost again. As they left the courtroom, the crowd of residents cheered, many of them offering congratulations and words of support. John and Karen walked out of the building, hand in hand, feeling a weight lift from their shoulders. They had won, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had been affected by the HOA's actions. The fight had been long and difficult, but they had made a difference. For John and Karen, the road ahead was clear. They had fought for their home, their family, and their community. And in the end, they had won. The HOA's grip on the neighborhood was broken, and the residents were finally free to live their lives without fear of exploitation. As they returned to the cabin, John and Karen sat on the porch, watching the sunset over the lake. It was a moment of peace, a moment to reflect on everything they had been through. And as they looked out over the water, they knew that they had done something important. They had fought for what was right, and in the end, they had succeeded. The final chapter of John and Karen's fight against the HOA was not just about winning in court. It was about rebuilding their lives and their community. As the dust settled from the legal battle, they found themselves reflecting on everything they had gone through. The emotional toll had been heavy, but the victory was sweet. The cabin, once again a symbol of family and heritage, stood tall and strong. It wasn't just a house. It was a testament to their determination and resilience. In the weeks that followed the court ruling, life slowly returned to normal. John and Karen focused on making their cabin a true home again. The repairs were complete, and the space once marred by the threat of destruction now felt fresh and new. The memories of the past few months, The stress, the long nights, the uncertainty began to fade into the background. They found comfort in their families' daily routines, whether it was enjoying dinner together, taking walks around the lake, or just sitting on the porch watching the sunset. It was a simple life, but it was theirs, and it was more precious than ever. The neighborhood, too, had changed. The HOA's power had been broken, and for the first time in years, the residents felt like they had a voice. Many of the families who had been too afraid to speak out before now found the courage to join together, sharing their stories and supporting each other. John had become something of a local hero. People stopped him on the street to offer their thanks, and many expressed how relieved they felt knowing that someone had stood up to the HOA. It wasn't just about the money or the settlement. It was about the change in the atmosphere of the entire community. People no longer felt like they were living in fear of the HOA's threats. They were free to live their lives without worry. One evening, as John and Karen sat by the fire pit outside, they talked about everything they had been through. The fire crackled and the night air was crisp with the sounds of nature all around them. "Do you think it's really over now?" John asked, looking at Karen with a mix of relief and caution. Karen smiled softly, her eyes reflecting the warmth of the fire. "I think so. The HOA has been forced to make changes. They've apologized and they've agreed to the audit. They can't act the way they used to anymore." "But you know they're still out there, right?" John said. "What if they try something else in the future?" Karen nodded, her expression thoughtful. "We'll be ready for whatever comes next. We've already shown them that we won't back down. If anything happens, we'll handle it the same way together." John smiled. He had always known that they made a great team, but after everything that had happened, it was clearer than ever. He was proud of how Karen had handled everything, how she had stayed strong for their family and the community. And he was proud of himself, too, for never giving up on their home. As they sat there, talking about their future, the quiet of the night was interrupted by a knock on the door. John looked at Karen, puzzled. They weren't expecting anyone. When John opened the door, he was greeted by a familiar face, Derek Harper, the town council member who had supported them during their battle with the HOA. Derek was smiling, holding a small box in his hands. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Derek said with a grin. "I just wanted to stop by and give you something." John stepped aside to let him in, and Derek handed him the box. Inside was a small plaque with an engraving, "For courage, resilience, and standing up for what's right." "We thought you deserved this," Derek said, his voice sincere. "You not only won your fight, but you gave hope to the rest of us. You reminded everyone that we don't have to live in fear." John felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't the kind of recognition he had expected, but it was the kind that meant the most. "Thank you, Derek. This really means a lot," Derek smiled. "It's the least we could do. You and Karen stood up for all of us. The town won't forget it." As Derek left, John and Karen stood there, silently reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The fight with the HOA had been difficult, but in the end, it had brought them closer to their community. They had proven that standing up for what's right wasn't just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone who had been intimidated or bullied by the system. The next few months were quieter. The HOA had complied with the terms of the settlement, and the neighborhood began to recover. The independent audit of the HOA's finances revealed even more mismanagement, and several members of the HOA board were forced to resign. The organization was overhauled, and new, more transparent leadership was put in place. John and Karen felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that their efforts had led to lasting change, but their work wasn't finished. Karen had continued to keep in touch with her federal contacts, ensuring that the HOA's fraud didn't go unnoticed. The investigation into the organization's finances revealed that this wasn't an isolated incident. Similar tactics had been used in other communities. With the help of the authorities, the HOA's leaders were held accountable, and their fraudulent activities were exposed for the world to see. Karen knew that this was a victory not just for their community, but for others who had been affected by similar organizations. One afternoon, while John was tending to the garden outside, Karen came outside with a letter in her hand. It was from the office of a local representative who had heard about their story and wanted to meet with them. "They want to talk about what we've done here," Karen said, her voice filled with excitement. "They want to know how we managed to bring the community together and stand up to the HOA." John smiled, proud of how far they had come. It's amazing to think about. A few months ago, we were just trying to save our cabin. Now we've helped change the whole neighborhood. Karen nodded. And we've shown that when people come together, they can make a real difference. No one is powerless, not when they have the truth on their side. As the years went by, John and Karen continued to live in their cabin, watching their children grow up in the home that had been passed down through generations. They never forgot the lessons they had learned during their battle with the HOA, that standing up for what's right was never easy, but it was always worth it. They had fought not just for their own home, but for the future of their neighborhood. And as they sat on their porch watching the sun set over the lake, they knew they had done something important. They had reclaimed their home, their community, and their peace. They had stood up to the forces that sought to tear them down, and in the end, they had emerged victorious, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice.